Alright, so you may have just seen the videos my brother and I did where we talked about the 4 original movies in the Texas Chainsaw franchise, and then the remake and the prequel to the remake. So now we'll go into these last 3, 2 of which are the Lionsgate timeline when they had a hold of it, and then that Netflix one that came out a few years ago. All of which are kind of reviled entries, for the most part it seems, in this franchise. And it's also this chunk of 3 where it was like, everybody seemed to kind of get in their head of, hey, what if we made Leatherface kind of a good guy, maybe? And we'll go into why that's probably never a good idea. But to start with Texas Chainsaw 3D, which came out January 2013, I was actually kind of defending this movie for a while, like when it first came out, and then through the years after, and I thought people were kind of making it seem a lot worse than it was. It may have also just turned out, having watched it again recently, there were aspects of it that I do like, that were what I was remembering. Obviously there's a lot of other problems here, but we'll kind of go into all of that. Starting with the fact that we are doing the retcon thing, where this is one that directly follows the original movie. We get a whole recap in the credits. We even get, like, when the cops are driving to the house and they drive by the truck, so we know that, like, that's the road where we left everything. And they end up at the Sawyer house, and now we've got, you know, some cool details here, like Gunnar Hansen's here playing a part, and we've got Bill Moseley playing Drayton now, and all these other family members, like I said, apparently the events of the original movie have just happened when this is happening. Not sure where all these other family members came from, but whatever. We need a really big shootout with a lot of bodies, so that's what we're going to get. And they even went out of their way to bring back Grandpa, and it's actually the actor in there that played Grandpa originally, even though he's just, like, in the background in one shot and then gets immediately shot in his second. He's got like 2 shots in the movie, and that's pretty much what they are. Background, getting shot, and that's it. But they brought him back anyway, so I guess that's nice. And once we establish this, then we establish another Sawyer we've never met, Loretta, who has a baby who is stolen and is going to grow up into Alexandra Daddario and be our main character. Who is named Heather, who's got the Sawyer genes in her anyway because she ends up having a bone collection, and she's the butcher at the grocery store. And then we go into the whole thing about her having a grandmother, who, confusingly enough, is Marilyn Burns. So, despite the fact that this is in the same world as the original movie, but okay, it doesn't matter. Gunnar Hansen's playing somebody else, but we didn't see his face before, so it doesn't matter. They're here, they're little Easter eggs. You get to point at the screen and say, I recognize that thing, or I get that reference, and that's the key to everything, apparently. So, once we get there, yeah, she does have a grandmother who has died, so now she's going to drive to Texas to her house, and then we're off to the races, and that's where everything is going to go back to shit, and Leatherface is going to pop out of the basement. And the bloodshed will continue. So, the first thing, obviously, and I feel like this is like one thing that people got so hung up on, for good reason, that if you just tweaked one detail of everything I just said, just a little bit, I don't know that people would have gone after this movie as heavily as they did. And yeah, that's this completely nonsensical timeline where we're supposedly starting in 1973 when the original movie would be happening, and then the actual movie came out in 74. But we're set in 73, and we're going to jump ahead in time, but instead of making it a timeline that makes sense, we're going to jump to present day when this movie was coming out. So it came out January 2013, which means we're now set in 2012. Which, as you can see, does not match any of the ages of the characters that we're looking at. So, really, all you needed to do was set the rest of the movie, the main portion of the movie here, in the year 2000. And a lot of the criticisms probably would have gone away. There still would have been plenty here, but I feel like that's a really big one, and that's the only change you needed to make. Final Destination 5 did it just fine, and it would have been very easy to do that here too, but as it is, we just have really weirdly aging characters. Whether it be the fact that Alexander Daddario would have to be like 40 or something. I think Paul Ray, who plays Hartman, was like 3 when the events would have been happening. Like, I don't know, but once you sort of let that go and you look at the rest of the movie, there's still plenty to talk about. But it is very easy to get stuck there before you even go into anything else. But yeah, so on their way, we're trying to pick up all of our traditions. We've got the hitchhiker, and as is tradition, at the beginning of a Texas Chainsaw movie, you really don't want to pick up somebody and somebody that needs a ride. And this basically, instead of setting it up as somebody that's potentially going to kill you, it just turns out being an untrustworthy thief, which is only setting up for our first kill of the movie. Which is, and then, like I said, then we really go off. As far as this being a 3D movie, and having seen it in 3D when it came out, there's not really a lot to say about that, despite the fact that the title Texas Chainsaw 3D is one of the only ways this movie is identifiable when you're looking at the other titles. There's stuff like, the way the chainsaw is angled will sometimes stick out of the screen. There's, he'll very clumsily swing it around, and so he's doing it at the camera. There's the moment when Kenny gets put on the hook and blood hits the camera, so there's stuff like that, but a lot of it's also, there'll be a big stick resting on a fence that's just sticking out, stuff like that. So, just utilizing it because it's there. So, that's really all I remember about it as a 3D movie. When you think of a Texas Chainsaw movie in 3D, you would think maybe a lot more creativity. We just talked about Piranha on the channel a few days ago, and the way that utilized it in some pretty fun ways, in some very self-aware ways. There's not really. It was just on the trend at this point, so there's that. But also, speaking about watching this in 2013, and, when you watch in 2013, you remember the trailer. Nobody watching this probably remembers the trailer for this movie, but there was one thing that showed a lot of promise. There's a really good scene in the trailer for this movie that unfortunately is not the way it plays out in the actual movie, which is when Heather hides in the casket when they're in the graveyard. And when you watch the movie, she gets in the casket and Leatherface kind of stalks around. Then he figures out she's in there and he starts sawing at her. I don't know if you guys remember, but the way this played out in the trailer was she got in the casket and she closed it, and when she closed it, the screen went dark, and we stayed in the darkness of the casket with her while we heard Leatherface sort of moving around up there. And that plays so much better. I don't know why the actual movie doesn't play that scene out that way, because that's a really effective way to do it. But, yeah, sometimes I guess the trailers are just better. So, another aspect that I did really like about this movie, and one of the things I remember the most about it, which may have played a big factor in me defending this movie previously, is I mentioned Paul Ray earlier, who is great. He should be one of those go-to character actors we see all the time, and it kind of drives me crazy that we don't, because he's fantastic, and he brings so much. It's such a much-needed personality to this movie whenever he's here, where he was the sort of, I guess, he seems just like a regular old vigilante at the beginning of the movie. I guess the next movie, Leatherface, we're going to talk about, gives him motivation, but we don't really have any sense of that in this. He's just kind of a vigilante that ultimately becomes the mayor. And he's sort of an unhinged character in his own right, and kind of takes us in that direction of, oh, what's worse, you know, like when you see, like, you know, what's worse between man and monster, and it's like, if the Sawyer family are the monsters, he would be the mankind side of it. He, and who is revealed to be his son later. And the whole Hartman name plays a big part in these two movies as this sort of counter to the Sawyer family, but, like, are they better or are they worse? There's stuff to play with here. There's a great moment when her friend is in the freezer and she's hiding, and when she sits up and jump scares the cop shoots her in the head, like, instinctually. And the way Hartman says, like, didn't happen, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen. And it's like, and then as it goes on and they become more unhinged, there is something that, we've seen it 1,000 times. It's probably most identifiable in this time period with the William Forsythe character in The Devil's Rejects. And it definitely feels like, especially in the next movie, that they're going down that path. And there is something there, like, even though it is something we've seen a million times before, there are ways to still make it effective, and there's still ways to explore it in interesting ways. And by making, you know, the Hartman character the most watchable character in the movie is a good start to that. But ultimately, I almost feel like, because we'll talk in the next movie about how they really derailed away from the Sawyer family and Leatherface, interestingly enough. But here, I almost think we didn't do that enough. I feel like there could have been more in the Hartman direction to set up that contrast and set up the moral ambiguity of who are we really rooting for. But what is here, I do really like, so I do think we could have expanded on that more. But as far as any other thing the movie might have up its sleeve, I guess it's interesting that Trey Songz is in this. But that, because he's kind of this name that's thrown in, it's like, oh, he was big at the time, I think. I don't really remember. But throwing him in and making him, like, seemingly a major character, and killing him off surprisingly early, I feel like I remember that kind of being a bit of an interesting left turn. And we've got that bit shortly after where they've crashed in the van and Leatherface is running up the street. And we get that shot of him running up the street seemingly from a distance, like he's got a ways to go. And then just suddenly he's there, like right in the window of the van, and he's coming at them. You could chalk that up to bad editing, which realistically might be more of what it is, but I like the fake out angle of that, of, oh, you think he's far away, but then, oh no, he's actually right here. So even the things that feel like they might have fucked up, but I think it actually ended up working in their favor, even if accidentally, so good for them. We do have a decent face change scene here, where he kills the cop and takes his face. That's one thing where, if you're going to do one of these movies right, you should have an effective scene of Leatherface killing somebody and then changing his face out. That's his whole thing. That's one of the things you have to do right. So I feel like it does that just fine. But there's also things, like I said, that just feel unresolved. I mentioned it's this big reveal of Hartman's son, the Scott Eastwood character. That ball of charisma, Scott Eastwood. But here, when I was saying there's not really enough of that and we don't explore that enough, the idea that we've talked about a lot now of it seeming like there could be a Sawyer family member anywhere, where you're, like, trapped in this town and anybody you attempt to trust could be a part of all of this. And like I said, they try to do that with the Hartman name as much as the Sawyer name now. And then, if I remember correctly, Scott Eastwood is the one that takes them to the place where we're going to have our climax. And once he drops them off, we just kind of abandon the character. Like, nothing else happens to him. I guess we're supposed to assume he's just still roaming out there. I don't know if they were going to do more with that, if Lionsgate didn't eventually lose the rights to this after what happened with the next movie, but I don't know. That's always been interesting to me that we set that up and then we just leave that character where he is at the door, even when we go into like our epilogue. So, like I said, I don't know what else they had planned for this, but you will notice that after a while it is like Lionsgate being Lionsgate and showing you that they're Lionsgate. They have the little Saw commercial in there where they go through like the carnival, and there's the person in the black robe and the pig mask with the chainsaw has a little run-in with Leatherface, and it's like, yeah, we're the Saw guys, remember? Which is really funny, because it feels like a Saw advertisement, but this was like, there was like a 7-year gap between Saw movies when this movie happened. We were like right in the middle of that 7-year gap, so just a little reminder, I guess, of, hey guys, go back and watch the Saw movies. We're really trying to continue, but it's all messy. But yes, like I was saying before, we are at a place now where we're getting, I guess, good guy Leatherface, and this movie infamously has a line in it that is so bad that I remember hearing about it before the movie even came out. Like, it was being singled out in reviews and everything. Even though it's like it's kind of spoilery, I guess you could say. You almost need to be prepared for something this cringy so that you can brace yourself for it. When we have Hartman subdued, and she throws Leatherface the chainsaw and she says the line. I was gonna say it just now, but it's so bad I'd be embarrassed to say it out loud. But, and that's not even the only one. Where they try to do the big one-liner thing. There's the moment later where I think it's the friend, like, thinks she has Leatherface down, and she says, "Welcome to Texas, motherfucker." And it's like, he lives here. You don't have to welcome. He knows... He's the cause of everything. He knows what this view of Texas is. So that attempt at a cool one-liner doesn't work for other reasons. So it's all kind of dumb. So, like I said, I think I remember the Hartman stuff the most looking back on it, and that's the stuff that really interested me. Like I said, I just love Paul Ray as an actor, and this character here, that it's like one of those you could really sink your teeth into at parts, but it also, like I said, does feel thinner than I remembered, and the fact that sort of overshadows the Texas Chainsaw factor of it, it's hard to say what exactly that says, but yeah, I do think it's overhated. I do think that a lot of it is brought down by the very poorly thought out timeline here. But, yeah, there's things in here that I think do work that you could have expanded on a little more. And like I said, maybe that was the plan, but then things went a different direction. But before that, let's go back and forward, because we have a prequel now, and this is a prequel to the original movie set in the timeline of the 3D movie. So, that we just talked about. So, this is Leatherface from 2017, which I did review when it came out, and I don't remember what I said, but I know it was one of my least favorite movies of that year, and I was not kind to it. And doing something I never thought I would do, I rewatched it so that we could talk about it now, and after having watched all the others recently, and I can seldom think of a movie with a more meaningless existence. So it was like, I didn't remember why I thought it was so bad, but and nothing really came back to me while I was rewatching it. But needless to say, it appears that my feelings have not changed, because I still hate it and I still really struggle to find redeeming qualities in it. I guess one we can start with is this opening, which is not bad. It's a nice reveal where we see, because we know going in that it's a prequel, so it's like, oh, Leatherface's childhood, I guess. What predictable bullshit is this going to be? So we see this innocent enough looking kid, and we see Lily Taylor, who's his mom, and they're at the table, and it's his birthday, and he's blowing out the candles and doing that whole thing. And you think, well, if this is the Sawyer family, they look awfully normal. And then a nice reveal that shows that Lily Taylor then refers to a thief at the end of the table, and that's when it's revealed this bloody man that is tied and gagged at the head of the table. And this person that supposedly was stealing, like, their pigs or something. It's not even really revealed if he's actually who they thought he was, because he denies that he's a thief, and we don't really trust anything this family says, because they're all insane. So this is a nice way to kind of throw us into the world and throw us into what this family was probably like before, how we see them in their later years in the original movie. So, okay, and he's gifted the chainsaw for his birthday, and we see Grandpa use the hammer, and it's giving us all the very obvious stuff, but it's like, alright, this is all adding up enough. It's very easy. It's sort of the low-hanging fruit of prequels, but okay, you're showing us stuff that we know when it was happening earlier, and to show that nothing's really changed, or maybe it's evolved in some nuanced ways or whatever. It's like, okay, great, fine. You're doing the prequel thing, okay, so far. And then it goes into... First of all, the first thing that's going to throw you off is right in the middle of this scene, when he's got the chainsaw for the first time, and we're seeing a big kill that his family's helping him with, the credits just randomly start to unceremoniously appear right in the middle of the scene when things are like really ramping up. Typically you do the big opening with no distractions, and then you'd cut to the title, and then maybe you could do opening credits after that during a more mundane scene, like when the couple's driving down the road, but we had to start them in early, and we see that there's like 10 executive producers, which is a great sign. And yeah, so that's maybe just a nitpick, but for me anyway, it's really distracting in this weird way. It seems like a poor choice, and it's way too early to see poor choices being made. They're bad omens as the movie's gonna go on. So yeah, we then meet this couple. We've got a Hartman and we've got a Hardesty, and it's like, oh, these are two names we recognize. I guess it's the father of Sally and Franklin, who is out on a date with Hartman's daughter. The Hartman in this case is the Stephen Dorff character, who I believe is supposed to be the father of Bert, the Paul Ray character from 3D. So we've got our nice connections here. We've built our community of characters. We've got something. And then we have the brutal, brutal killing of this Hartman's daughter. And that's what sets everything off. Now we've got Stephen Dorff as this vengeful character who's going after the Sawyers. He takes Jed away, Jed, who we know is going to be Leatherface, and puts him in this home, and it turns out he's like this corrupt sheriff that's put all of these kids in this home, and that's his thing, I guess, as he separates kids from their parents and does that whole thing. Now, we don't really get much else of a background on that, with the exception of like a throwaway line of dialogue. So it's kind of blurry. Like, in the previous movie, we knew that Hartman was bad news and monstrous in his own way. And there was this balance of, well, which one is worse? So they seem to be trying to carry that with this Hartman and making him seem like he's a little too unhinged. But starting the movie with the brutal and senseless killing of his daughter, and then saying, I'm gonna take Jed away from you, crazy Lily Taylor, and I feel like there's definitely not enough bad things here committed by Hartman, or things that we totally can't understand, particularly with his hatred for this family that we already know. And if you had no other background, if this was the first Texas Chainsaw movie you were going into, we already have the opening scene. where they have the guy tied up at the dinner table and brutally chainsaw and hammer him to death. So, when he may or may not have even been a thief. So, there's... I, I really don't know what they were trying to do with the Hartman character in this as far as a moral ambiguity sort of thing. It feels very imbalanced in regards to how we see the Sawyers versus this Hartman character. So that's something that really kind of throws the first part and the last part of the movie out of whack, is trying to get us to believe that Hartman may or may not be on par with the Sawyers. It's not... No, we don't have that thing in this, as hard as they may try. But let's go into one of the other things that's just... I keep wanting to say the biggest problem. There's something to be said when we're about to approach a problem, and every single time I want to say, and this might be the movie's biggest problem. But you could say that about, like, all of its problems. Because we have this, I think it's a 10-year time jump into the 60s, because we started in the 50s. And now we're at this home where all of these, I guess, potentially kids that Hartman has rounded up. We don't know how many of them actually are Hartman's kids, as it were. But we set up, we don't know which one is going to be Jed or Leatherface, because once they're put in the home, they all get a different name. But it's clear there's somebody they want us to focus on, which directly contradicts the poster we've already seen of a much thinner built Leatherface. So we have this character who's like, he's a much bigger character and he's got long hair. He looks like who would be a young Leatherface. And he acts like somebody who would be a young Leatherface. It's actually a really good bit of casting if it had actually been Leatherface. Because the way they set this up, he's actually very believable. And even when we see him later, and we see his protective instincts, and we see his murderous instincts, every possible thing about this character is essentially Leatherface. So when you're doing a prequel, this is the problem, is your big criticism could be, oh, the direction this goes, this just doesn't feel like Leatherface at all. This does not feel like some probable backstory for him as we go further. He doesn't look like him. He's not built like him. And you have all these issues, but it's like, it was right there. If you had just basically kept it that it was this character that they call Bud, you probably just would have had something. But because you knew there was not much else to this meaningless movie, you had to do the twist thing that negates every good thing you were doing. Everything that made sense. And then it's like, well, we've got to do this twist. So that's kind of where everything falls apart. But even before that, there is surprisingly little focus on this, because there's not really much, because there's so much focus on Bud, and Bud is such a clear candidate. Something they were trying to do with this movie is just not really coming through, which is, oh, because they all have different names, it could be any of them. But it's like, nah, we're kind of mainly focused on the one guy. So, no, I don't know how many people are actually going to watch this and think about, oh, it could be anybody. I guess there was an earlier idea, or an earlier script maybe, where it was going to end up being Clarice somehow. So let's talk about that, because there are two side characters here that should be only side characters, but who kind of really come into the foreground here. It's Clarice and it's Ike, the two people that help everybody else break out of the home. So we've got Clarice and Ike, plus we've got Jackson and the nurse, and we've got Bud. And this is going to be what our story is. This is not a movie about the Sawyer family in their early days. This is basically about us playing the Leatherface shell game of which of these people is him. We've got this clear candidate here, and then everybody else here, I guess. But again, I don't know how many people are even thinking about that when watching this. So we just go on, and we're mainly... You could tell who the writers really started to fixate on, because it basically becomes the Clarice movie with Ike by her side. And oh, by the way, there's other characters here too. I don't know if it was intentional or not to throw us off the scent, but Jackson, for the longest time, almost feels like a completely pointless character. That's just like one character too many in this group. So, if you're approaching it as a mystery of, oh, which one of them's Leatherface, that might tip you off as, oh, which one is here for otherwise no reason. So, regardless, anything it's trying to do feels like it falls apart in one way or another, regardless of how you're watching this movie. So, yeah, but this focus on Clarice and Ike is really... They're really leaning hard into the... Look how over-the-top crazy these characters are. And you can just see... It's insane how... Like, there's the scene later where they're fucking, and while they're fucking, she's licking a dead body. And it's like, this movie is about to bust a blood vessel from trying so hard to be shocking and crazy and all of that. And it's really this poor actress, who's giving it her all, and it's just a really embarrassing adolescent way to do crazy. And we're talking about the Texas Chainsaw franchise. This is a franchise that has Nubbins and Chop Top in it. And I love those characters. We talked about that in the previous video, how Chop Top's one of the best characters. And I feel like they're trying to recreate that in some sense. And it's just not... It's not this character. It's just not. Especially since this one is trying to be more grounded. And the movie that Chop Top is in, Texas Chainsaw 2, is so in a different world entirely. Another whole conversation we had about that movie in the previous video. And trying to combine these two is just not going to work. Like I said, especially not through this character, who we really just don't care about. Because we know Clarice is not Leatherface. We seriously are gonna doubt that Ike is. So there's no reason for the movie to just become obsessed with these two characters. So it's like it just fully detours for most of the movie to focus on these characters we don't give a shit about. But this is a really big issue here. It's like, no, we're not going to focus more on Drayton or Nubbins or even Grandpa, which would have been much more interesting. Let's focus on these two characters that we do not care about, while still not really knowing who Leatherface is in a movie called Leatherface. So, okay. But it's also like, there's a lot of cases where you're watching it and a detour makes sense, because this movie doesn't feel like anybody's passion project. It feels like writers that had a job to do, and most of it was, oh, we've been tasked to do a prequel to the original movie. Maybe if we do this thing, that'll do. Like, there's just a lot of, yeah, this'll do. It has no feelings that anybody had any passion whatsoever. And then, like I said, we come full circle, and we've got not just, a potential Sawyer family that's mainly run by Lily Taylor, who is barely a character that we know otherwise, but then we also have the Hartman character back in it. And there's this moment where Hartman kills Clarice. And Clarice is supposed to be such a crazy, evil character. You would think this would be a moment of triumph. But again, I think they're trying to be ambiguous here, because it gets to the point where I think we're supposed to believe that the Hartman character is out of control. But he has killed who is clearly supposed to be the most crazy and dangerous character in the movie. And like I said, we started off with the brutal, senseless killing of his daughter. I just don't know how we are supposed to buy, in any way, shape, or form, this whole Hartman is just as bad as them thing. But then there seems to be another switch where when the nurse and Hartman kind of are together and trying to get out, then we've kind of switched back to, oh no, it is the Sawyers who are the monstrous ones. I don't know. I don't think the movie knows either. But yeah, then we eventually get to our end. And by the time we get to there, I'm not really sure how we're even supposed to feel about our only good character being decapitated because she insulted the mother. So, I don't know. I don't know what... I don't know how we're supposed to think about all this, but all I know is that none of it works. Like, none of it at all, to me anyway. So, I guess that's all I can really say about this one. Maybe I'll remember it better this time, now that I've seen it a second time. I don't know, but I don't really have I don't have any interest in revisiting it a third time, so hopefully nothing like this comes up again. So that puts us at the conclusion of this video, which is our next new timeline in the 2022 Netflix movie, where, again, we're just directly following up the original movie, I believe, and we're going 50 years later now, so we are in a bit more of an accurate timeline as far as age goes, I guess. But even so, I still remember one of my hang-ups about this a few years ago was that thinking about how old Leatherface must be at this point versus what we see Leatherface doing in this movie, so, and how that doesn't really add up either. He has to be a very old Leatherface at this point, and I think they made his hair kind of gray, and that might be about it. And maybe he's shrinking a little bit, I don't know, but it's something I try not to get too hung up on, even though sometimes it happens. But I wasn't as hung up on it as a lot of people got hung up on the 3D horrible, terrible timeline. But still, this one is trying to bring it back a little bit. We've got John Larroquette narration again, which was very missed. And we've got this focus now on updated things like social media and talking about canceling people and the quote-unquote woke culture, or whatever they want to call it, and the gentrification angle that we're going here that's much more blatant than previous. And there's a lot of things this movie wants to say, and I remember when it first came out that I was much kinder to this movie, because it did have interesting directions it wanted to take, and it kind of wanted to do that while also being this sort of old-fashioned Texas Chainsaw movie. And once again, there are scenes that work, where I kind of had this on par with 3D in my head at the time that it came out. And again, revisiting it, I feel like, especially with this being a Netflix movie, I feel like I have to be one of the only people in existence that has seen this one, the 2022 one, more than once, if I had to guess. But, so, yeah. And it wasn't out of, oh, I want to see it again. Again, like Leatherface, it was to catch up and do this whole thing after seeing the previous movies again so recently. So, going into this updated angle where we have this confused jumble going on of having these Gen Z characters come in, and it's like, are they, just opportunistic? Are they the, woke characters as far as, like, conservatives or whatever would call them? Or are we, sympathizing with them and their plights here? And I feel like with these characters and the way they're treated and the way they're played, it kind of feels like we're trying to please everybody and or we're trying to please nobody. I don't know. I know that Fede Alvarez had, who was a producer, had a statement about we weren't really trying to do a black and white thing where there's a lot more gray area in life, so we're basically making it to where you can't really decide who's good or who's bad or who's making right decisions or wrong decisions or whatever. And I can totally get that to a sense, especially for realism's sake, because that is how the world is. However, it also feels like it almost feels like laziness feels like a strong word, but just an unwillingness to have direction, I suppose, in these choices is also what it feels like. So you have all this stuff, and you have all these talking points, throwing in stuff like a guy saying he's going to cancel Leatherface before he gets chainsawed up. And you can take all of that for what you will, but at the end of the day, this is a movie where somebody gets stabbed with their own wrist bones. This is a movie where people get their faces cut off and their heads cut off. And the whole thing happens, and it becomes the gore fest that we expect it to be. I almost wonder, since they wanted to go back to the roots of the original movie so badly, and this one is such a bloodbath, I do wonder how it would have gone and how it would have played if they tried to be a bit more skillful with their filmmaking like Tobe Hooper was, and if they made a modern Texas Chainsaw movie that has as little gore in it as the original movie. How that would go. But nobody's going to have the balls to do that in this day and age. So regardless, we have to do the bloodbath, and that's what we get. And I feel like this one is gory enough that gore fans who are here for that should and would be relatively pleased with it. There is one scene that's very skillful in how it combines both, where we have the girl that's in the van, and Leatherface is outside, and he has cut off the face of the guy, and he holds it up to the sun. It's a really nice shot, actually. And then he kind of disappears, and this character is stuck in the van, and we don't know where Leatherface is outside. Maybe he's right here, maybe he walked away, but we can't see him or hear him, so we do not know where he is. And there's really good suspense built up in this scene, and that's really nicely done. But once we've done that, and we've shown that we're capable of genuine suspense, then we sacrifice all the suspense and all the scares for basically just the gore. I think another thing I talked about in the previous video that I still like is how surprisingly well lit the dark scenes are. And I mean that as a good thing, where when a character is in the dark and Leatherface is stalking around, I like the fact that we can actually see what's going on. How that's been a problem in a lot of horror for some time now, is it just feels like everything's in darkness and you're just waiting. It kind of kills the suspense when you can't see what you're supposed to be looking at, or what's supposed to be building the suspense. So I did like the way they handled that, but then we've got the whole legacy character thing. We bring back a much older Sally, who is now basically the exact same character as the 2018 version of Laurie Strode. And she's shotgun-toting, and she's ready to kick ass and kill the killer for good. And here, not only is Sally wasted because she's just not in the movie very much, but the idea of killing her in such an unceremonious way. This movie especially came out when there was a lot of retconning going on in movies. And this is something where there's times where I can really understand retconning, for sure. However, we get to a point where there's so many different timelines that stakes eventually just don't exist anymore. So any character's death pretty much means nothing. I remember watching Sally die in this movie and just feeling not a damn thing about it. And that's really not where you want to be, and I know that's not where this movie wanted to be. But it just nothing really has emotional stakes or meaning. And you can really see that when we get to the end of the movie, and we've been following these two sisters the whole time. We get their backstories, we get a feel of their relationship and the closeness and the distance that's turned back into closeness, whatever it may be, and everything is flushed out enough. And so when we get to the very last scene of the movie and we think everything's okay and we think everything is safe, Leatherface pops back up one more time and decapitates the older sister in front of the younger sister just as she gets away. And I remember when I first saw it thinking that there was an admiration I had for the cold-bloodedness of that ending. But now watching it back and thinking about the ending of Leatherface, the previous movie as well, it brings a pointlessness to it. Like, and there's times where that can be effective and would have been effective. I think especially back in like the 70s 80s era of horror, that the pointlessness at the end of the day was much scarier, and now it feels like attempted shock value rather than an intentional sort of bleakness. But it all feels pretty empty. So and it feels like a Netflix movie, so it feels really corporate in general too. So it wasn't so much about killing the sister; it was about showing, oh, Leatherface is still here, which means we can do more movies anytime we want, and you'll watch them once, and you'll go on to the other thing, and you'll completely forget that they exist and any frame of the movie that you saw. So, which is what I imagine most people did with this movie. So, yeah, I was probably too kind to this one when it first came out, but I suppose I'm not in too much of a different place with 3D, and I still despise Leatherface, and yeah, this one gets a little worse in retrospect. So I think that's where we stand on these three now. So that should be about it. That should be it for this month. We have one more video tomorrow. It's the big video we all did as a panel, and I think it's one of the most fun videos we've ever done on the channel, so hopefully you get a kick out of that. And that'll be how we end this month. So hopefully all of this was worth it. Hopefully you had some fun with what all came out and all the discussions we had. And I think that's where we can leave it until we finish tomorrow. So until then, I think that's it.